Hi everyone, welcome to this webinar. While people trickle in, just a couple of housekeeping things. We've got questions turned on so that throughout the webinar, if anything arises, you can pop it in the box and we'll leave some time at the end to come and answer those for you. I'll just give it a few more seconds. Okay, so I'm Molly Green. I write for EV Infrastructure News. I'm very pleased to be hosting a brilliant panel on this webinar about EV myth busting. I think that low carbon technologies more broadly face quite a lot of backlash from the public, but in particular for the EV infrastructure sector, you get into a cycle where there's got to be a level of uptake of EVs for the business case to be made for the charging. And yet, if it's perceived that the charging network isn't sufficient, there isn't that uptake. And so you get into this horrible chicken and egg cycle. Obviously, some of the barriers that are presented to CPOs are things that necessarily require input from either the government or other third parties, but I think it's increasingly important for charging businesses to directly engage consumers, particularly because the public is sort of generally being fed a narrative that at best is maintaining a status quo and at worst is kind of actively preventing the transition. So I'm going to ask everyone to introduce themselves now, starting with James, and then we'll get into it.
Hi everybody. My name's James. I work in the business development team in the insights department of ZapMap. So we take the data that powers the ZapMap app and supply it to organisations that might want to know where all charging devices are or how and when they're being used.
And hi everyone, I'm Vicky Edmonds. So I'm the head of EVA England, which some of you are members of. So we are a drivers members association and represent the driver in discussions with government and industry in the transition to electric, which means campaigning on behalf of drivers, trying to get the right regulations, the right behaviour to help this transition work for all of us.
Everyone, my name is Tanya Sinclair. I'm the CEO of Electric Vehicles UK. We're an industry body powered by companies from across the e-mobility sector, from OEMs to charging companies, software, fleet and leasing, and beyond that. And our objective is to increase the uptake of electric vehicles to really to ensure that everybody has access to information and to the products that help them in their decisions to go electric.
So on decision making and learning more about EVs, I think it's important first to kind of frame our discussion around what we mean when we talk about misinformation about EVs and EV infrastructure. So Tanya, I wonder if you could start by giving your view of what the issue there is.
Yeah, sure. So, in the 15 odd years I've been in this sector, it really has been the last 3 or 4 that have been characterized by engaging with stakeholders and drivers, and of course stakeholders are drivers too, in a way that they're skeptical and they're sort of net reaction is concerned rather than curious about these. And rather than spend a lot of time dissecting the reasons that might be, the source of information and misinformation, disinformation out there, I think what I focus on is the tactic that we use to not necessarily counteract that misinformation, because you could spend all day trying to correct and counteract all of the information, but really populate the space with a much more robust and clear-headed actual approach to talking about electric vehicles that isn't necessarily grounded in your own personal experience, because that doesn't reflect everybody's experience, but then thinking about really the realities and really just how normal driving in the UK is.
Yeah, and I think that normality is perhaps a really key piece of it. We're well beyond a point when an EV was a sort of crazy new technology that only like car enthusiasts maybe were into. So we're going to reference facts, I think, a lot. James, you're well positioned to speak about that in your role at ZapMap. So as you see it, kind of where are we at currently? What's the landscape looking like for EV charging?
Yeah, just following on from Tanya's point around misinformation, it's often said that misinformation thrives in a vacuum. So hopefully the facts can fill that in and combat that, at least to a degree. So the first big one, I think, is just how many places there are now you can actually charge an electric vehicle. Probably much more than most non-EV drivers would think. So we're looking at 88,513 devices across 45,242 different locations. So that's on-street, destination and en route locations as of the end of this January. And I suppose another big one as well would be the speed of charging at those locations. So it's so much quicker than people think. I think a lot of people typically think it's either an hour or 24 hours, and actually a lot of people will ultra rapid charge for as little as 20 minutes and still get most of their battery filled up. And then the final one as well, and this to me points to the fact that there is an information mismatch between what you're reading in the mainstream media and what EV drivers are actually living in their day-to-day realities, and it's the EV driver satisfaction. So I know lots of surveys are abound. The ZapMap driver surveys around 4,000 drivers, and we've been doing it year after year. And each time when we ask them, would you ever go back, we get around the same number, which is 90% of UK EV drivers saying they wouldn't ever consider switching back to a non-EV.
And as you say, James, I think that really does sum it up, doesn't it? It's an issue of perception more than it is of experience. Now, with that being said, Vicky, I know that in your role engaging with EV drivers, there are still concerns and issues that do arise for drivers sometimes. And I think that while what we don't want to do is fixate on those and assume that they are the story for everyone, I do think it would be remiss not to acknowledge or mention those. So yeah, Vicky, if you wanted to share sort of the key complaints, for lack of a better word, that do arise.
Yes, sure. So I'll switch slides as well to some of our EVA England stats, which I think mostly complement what James has said, but as you see, also flesh out perhaps some of the issues that aren't working so well. So I think, like ZapMap, we also survey drivers, but we do it from a slightly different angle, where we're really trying to get to the nub of what's working well and what's not working so well for EV drivers out there. And we also separate it into those particular circumstances. So we look at incomes of households, we look at their personal circumstances in terms of how they charge, so do they have driveways or not, and also whether or not they have disabilities. And I think what we find is that for most EV drivers, as James has said, this works really well. 95% of EV drivers would recommend their vehicles to family and friends, and many feel that the system is improving. So I guess one of the biggest stats there is the public charging network, which is often the part of the transition that gets the most heat, where nearly 70% of EV drivers feel it's improved simply over the last year and quite significantly. But what we also find is that it works really well if you are a high income household, so you can afford the cars, if you have access to private charging. So over 9 in 10 EV drivers do have a driveway, they do have access to some kind of off-street private charging. Which means less than 10% of those without driveways at the moment, even though nearly 50% of the driving community as a whole doesn't have a driveway. So that's quite a large difference there in terms of who's buying these EVs. And those with disabilities still really struggle, particularly using the public charging network. So as an organisation, we try to hone in on, okay, how can we make this system work for everybody? So, how do we make sure that low and middle income households can access this market? Are kind of government incentives in the right place? What's happening on the used market? what can we do about that charging experience? So cost of public charging is really high, and I think half of drivers without driveways are finding it more expensive to charge their EV than their petrol and diesel vehicles. So that absolutely needs urgent attention from government and industry. And also that charging experience, which I know Tanya knows very well as somebody who does charge without a driveway, is quite inconsistent and patchy. So there are obviously really good charging events, but we get a lot of complaints from drivers who are just super frustrated that the charge points aren't working, that they're not connecting properly, that the charge doesn't work because they haven't connected in the right sequence, the pre-authorization. So there's a lot of work to do to still get this industry up and running and as seamless as possible for every household in the country that needs to use its car.
Yeah, and there's definitely a piece where we need to be engaging consumers and people who haven't yet made the switch, but there's a customer base already who need to be catered to and treated fairly and correctly. To circle back to one of the things you said, Vicky, about how people would recommend their vehicles to family and friends, that reminded me of, I was at an event last week and someone was saying that so often when someone goes into a dealership to buy a car, or online nowadays, and that's secondhand or new, very often they will say, well, I asked the person I know who's the most into cars and the most interested for their advice. And so it really is key that people who have good experiences with their EV and driving an EV are able to share that. We obviously can't rely just on the fact that will build momentum as people continue to make the switch. I wonder what you are all already doing to engage with the public and get sort of information and facts like the ones we've shared now out to them.
Why don't I comment on that? Because it's the raison d'etre of EV UK is to speak direct to the consumer, and in the presentation that we do, much as I would love to speak to every driver out there, speaking specifically to two segments, which is those are curious about EVs and those that think that they're confident that they could fit into their lives, but they're not yet driving an EV. And within that group, as you rightly say, there's dozens of source material, surveys and so on out there that confirm that friends and family are the most trusted sources of information that people are considering when they're thinking about their next car purchase or what they'll drive next. And if those sources of information, your peer group, if that peer group is not well proven EVs, or they're getting information from social media that's opinion based and not rooted in fact, then that is going to affect the decisions of those individuals. And so it becomes then increasingly challenging to share objective information when it's being challenged by trusted information which is not accurate. And then when you layer on top of that these are not just drivers out in their everyday lives, these are also procurement managers, these are also people in positions of authority and power in your local council or even your government who are subject to this misinformation. You start to see the ripple effect of how difficult it can be to get the sort of just the fact that these are normal vehicles out there. So what in EV UK, to kind of give you a little bit sort of behind the curtain of the strategy and how we approach this challenge, is that we are by definition not experts. I've worked in this industry for a long time. I am just a driver, and when we talk to people about the considerations that they're making about EVs, they can get spec information on vehicles and pretty much anywhere, but it's very, very readily available. The bit that's not readily available, unless you're willing to go into the sales process headlong, is the physical access to the product, so the car and the charger, but also those lifestyle questions that really can't be easily answered because they're very meaningful to you as an individual. So will you get your dog in the back, or your double buggy, and those kinds of things. And one of our kind of routes to market, if you like, to our consumer groups is getting vehicles out there and just letting people talk about them, see them, and take away some of that mystifying kind of lack of confidence that they can only sort of break down by sitting with the vehicle, and that they might not be willing to do so in a sales environment. So we're trying to give a pre-sales opportunity to become familiar with EVs until they're ready to then go into the sales process.
And I think there's also that sort of stereotype about car sales in particular, where people are trying to hoodwink you. And so, as you say, it's very important to kind of get in before that stage and build up the good experience and the positive outlook. Vicky, to come back a bit to what you were saying, where you hear stories of actually these quite negative experiences, are there then cases that are sort of comparable and there's been a solution found that is able to set an example? Or do you think that we're still at a point where, as these issues arise, they're kind of novel and require some thinking about to solve?
Yes, I think there's definitely cases where people are making it work really well for them, and there's and you know, a bit to Tanya's point, trying to get those positive stories out there is really important. So we have drivers who, you know, spread. I mean, our membership is spread across the country. Drivers in all regions who make this work very well. They don't have off-street. I think my connection just dropped. Am I back online? I think my connection just dropped, but hopefully. So we have drivers who don't have off-street parking who make it work really well, and they often share their stories with us. And we have blogs on our website from some of our members about, you know, their positive experiences at different charge points and on different journeys. So we try to get some of those positive stories out. But I think what I think the worst case is that you have drivers who have had really frustrating experiences. The press gets hold of it and it balloons, but actually those frustrating experiences are sometimes quite ubiquitous. So particularly in some local authority areas where perhaps the local authority, although it's spending ring-fenced government money on charging, isn't necessarily doing it in the right way or the best way. Local authorities who continue to refuse access to cross-pavement solutions, which frustrates a lot of drivers. And then I think the system, there's an issue with the system, like the system is failing drivers, and we need to make sure that that is addressed. So we need to make sure that government regulation actually protects the driver, it protects the consumer, that framework sits behind the rollout of what is quite a fast developing industry, but make sure it's rolling out in the right way so that everyone can use these cars, can access them and can afford them. So I think there's a lot of work to do to make sure that framework is right. And then that framework also needs enforcing. So many on this call obviously know about the public charge point regulations, which are supposed to protect us all about reliability and payment transparency. But the number of issues that drivers have where charge points don't work, they don't understand what price they're paying, they still rumble on, and yet those regulations are in place. So we still haven't got the enforcement regime that sits around this industry right yet. And I think once that is there, then you hope that experiences will continue to improve and these negative stories get less and less, because you can't sort of disagree with somebody whose local authority keeps refusing them access to a charge point, or who keeps turning up to a charge point and it can't work. Those are failures of the system rather than misinformation, and we need to address those as well.
Absolutely. I guess there's also, to some degree, it's a failure of the system and therefore not on the industry that's trying to support drivers to take the steps to change. You also mentioned, Vicky, the sort of widespread members that you've got, and if this isn't putting you too much on the spot, James, I wonder if you could say, sort of with your knowledge of where public charging in the UK is generally spaced, sort of how you think it differs regionally and whether there needs to be a difference in messaging sort of in those regions in order to cater for that.
So the last bit I really read on this that was really well researched and quite informative was a piece that Field Dynamics did based on our data as well. They looked at how charge point demand was matching EV uptake across constituencies all across the country. And the good news is actually they found in most places or charger provision is outstripping demand at the moment. And there's some places that are getting it absolutely brilliantly right. So as you might imagine, right in the middle of London, Westminster, is set right the way out to it was either 2030 or 2050, but basically they've got all the chargers they'll need for a long time. And across the rest of the country, it's well, especially compared to what you might read in the newspapers, it's very positive. And I'm sure there's a theme to this whole webinar, which is the work isn't done yet, and we know it's not finished yet, and there's still more to be done. And you know, you do occasionally encounter frustrations and things that could be improved and things that could be done better. But yeah, certainly in terms of charge point deployment, we're moving in the right direction.
If I could just jump in at that point, I think also, Vicky, was that your research as well? I think with the back charge points, it was, wasn't it?
Yeah,
so,
it was.
Yeah, and it's really useful, and we mustn't lose sight of the numbers when it comes to us as a sector monitoring how we're delivering, not against target. Well, we'll talk about targets maybe another time, but how we're delivering an increased number of chargers. One thing that I think is also important to factor is the meaningful kind of lived experience of people's usage of those chargers. Sort of under all those numbers, a real person's usage of infrastructure. And Westminster is such an interesting example because on paper looks great. The numbers of vehicles registered versus numbers of stations in the ground. The thing is that the vast majority of people using those stations are not residents in Westminster, let alone in London. And so there's a whole kind of complexity of whether local authorities are serving residents and businesses or travelling to and through traffic, including taxis, private hire, and so on and so forth. So there's a lot of complexity underneath that, and it also speaks to how we read into national statistics as well. So when you look at the numbers of stations going in, it's going up. We all know it's not going up uniformly across the country, nor should it, right? Because there's a supply and demand flex across the country. But as individual drivers, when we speak to people thinking about EVs at our events, they don't. The number of national stations nationally is not a meaningful number to them. But what is important is where is the stations, not even nearest to me, but in the places I go. So in my supermarket, in cinema or in my gym, or things like that. And not only where are they, but can I use them and are they working? So there's a sort of contextual layer on top of the statistics that I think is also equally important to consider when we're thinking about how we talk to drivers or prospective EV drivers about their confidence to use the charging network.
Can I also actually, and thank you, because actually dwelling on the map, which is great plug-in for the map. So yes, that's right. It was a joint project with ZapMap and EVA England and Field Dynamics, and it's available on our website if people want to go in and check. But one of the most interesting things to me about that map is some areas like Westminster, but also Coventry, which has an amazing charge point rollout program and has got a huge number of chargers in the ground. However, their EV uptake is one of the lowest in the country. And I think, I think, Tanya, you touched on some of the issues. Whatever's happening, the charge points are there. They're very visible. There's a lot of them, but drivers are still not being persuaded to go electric in that area. And obviously, we'll need to see if that changes over time. But it shows that there's a breakdown there between the provision of the infrastructure and people's appetite for electric. And it could be the location of the chargers, more likely the cost, I would suspect, in some of those areas, that it's just too unaffordable for people still. But it shows us that even where you're providing a lot of infrastructure, you're still not necessarily persuading residents that this is the right thing for them to do. And I think there's a lot of work to do there to unpick that and to make sure the system works for everyone.
Definitely. And I think beyond the sort of cost benefit that is, I would say, the most common reasoning given for why an EV is a better option, there's sort of a bit of a discrepancy emerging here, where on the one hand it's very complex and the needs and what people need to know about is difficult to track, but at the same time what the consumer and the public want is simplicity, and they want, as you said, Tanya, to be able to find out where they can have their need for charge be that at the lowest possible cost or as fast as possible or in a location that's really convenient. They need to be able to find that information in as simplistic a way as possible. Obviously, ZapMap is a platform that is mapping out charge points and trying to do exactly that. But I wonder if there's more to be done, or if it's, again, about awareness and kind of getting it out that these services do exist and are an option, and perhaps just aren't being found by the people that need them.
Yeah, one, like, just on that point, Tanya mentioned supermarkets earlier, and yeah, that for me feels like a really obvious one. It's somewhere we all have to go to every week, apart from those really smart people who do their food shopping online. I'm not one of those, but yeah, a lot of people go to a supermarket every single week, and I think when they start seeing charges there, it's irrefutable. It's in your face. I've heard people talking about signage, better signage on major roads, pointing people to charge points as well. And again, that's something that we see charge points all the time because we use them, and it's like seeing yellow cars everywhere. If you drive a yellow car, we know what they look like. Even the little ones that are built into the lampposts that are designed to not be seen, we can normally spot them. But do non-EV drivers see them in as many places as we know they're in? And do they use apps like ZapMap to find them if they don't have an electric car?
Yeah, I'd say since we launched EV Infrastructure News, I don't know whether suddenly loads of EV charge points have gone into the ground near where I live, or if I've just started noticing them. But it really is one of those things that I think when you know where to look, it's there to see. I suppose we've not directly addressed it, but there is a pretty loud voice, primarily in the media, but also on social media, that is saying effectively the opposite of what we're saying now. Is there any room to engage directly with that? Or do you think it's better to sort of tune it out and just push on with our own narrative?
Why don't I have a go at answering that? I've got to sort of separate out various sources and the intentions of the sort of information out there. So you've got opinion, right, and that is fine. But I think what we need to do, I think a kind of collective responsibility on ourselves as consumers, not just in the EV context, but just generally, we need to apply our critical thinking hat a bit more firmly on our heads when we look at information out there, and think about the source and think about the intention of what that information is why that person or that organization has chosen to put it out there. And that goes right from your guy on TikTok having a go at something or other to do with EVs, right through to your conspiracy theorists, right through to your manufacturer of vehicles who says that there's no demand for EVs, as you will have seen in the news recently. There's always a reason that people are putting this information out into the public domain, and we've got to be quite circumspect when we think about what is the purpose of the person saying in making that intervention at that time. And like I said before, we thought when we started EV UK back in 2024 about whether we go in and correct everything and be the sort of source of information that's trying to constantly refute everything that is not correct out there in the media. And actually, there are organisations doing that, and where there are real sort of patent misinformation out there, that is important. And actually, what people are looking for is not more noise, but just somewhere where they can just talk about how it's relevant to them. And you can really tie yourself up in knots if you just build more information on top of information on top of information. And actually, what we're doing is trying to cut through that and really have in-person, one-to-one meaningful conversations about how EVs and EV charging, of course, will fit into your lives or into your business. And I think that that is one other way of addressing what is an increasingly significant mountain of information of kind of varying levels of trustworthiness.
I was just going to say on the back of that, Tanya, yeah, I think you're right. That whole, you're almost on the back foot constantly, aren't you? If all you do is refute EV negativity, even if some of it is outright lies, then yeah, it just takes all your energy, and we see it all in our industry all the time, right? You could spend your life on LinkedIn arguing with people in comments, just at the kind of professional level. But yeah, what do you do?
I think there's the good stats around people trust friends and family more than anyone else at the moment, because they don't trust government. They don't particularly trust industry. They don't trust banks. They don't trust, politicians. They trust their friends and family. And I think trying to get, and certainly as a drivers network, there's a lot of our members who go out and do roadshows and events all the time and try to kind of talk to their friends and family and persuade them that this is the right thing to do. I think that's probably one of the most powerful ways of trying to beat some of that misinformation in the press. So trying to persuade you, but it's not actually as people are talking about it. But I do know many drivers who get frustrated with having those conversations because they feel like they're preaching to people who don't want to listen, and it's that national skepticism about EVs is still there. And one of our surveys showed that 40% of non-EV drivers say they will never go electric yet. And it's not necessarily because they don't know anything about these cars. They're not making this as an informed choice, an informed judgment. They're saying that because of what they're reading, because of what they're hearing, because they don't believe the people who are driving electric and that it genuinely works for them. And I think when we come back to it, a lot of it actually comes down to cost. Like if you can get people into these cars because it's just more affordable for them to suddenly transition, then that is one of the most powerful ways. So the sort of salary sacrifice schemes, benefit in kind schemes, those have been really powerful ways of getting certainly people that I know who would never have bought electric a year ago suddenly have an electric car because their company is only going to lease them an electric car. And then once they're in them, then the stats show that drivers never look back, that they love it, that they recommend it to friends and families. So I think, Tanya, that's right, you've got to get people into these cars, but one of the ways you can do that is just by making them more affordable and making them more cost effective than getting into a combustion engine car. And that is definitely working on the ground from what we see, from the cost figures that we see coming in.
But that's just on that as well. I think that's that also points to misinformation to me, as in cost concerns. Yes, EVs are more expensive to buy up front in quite a few cases, but actually I think there's a lot of drivers who over the lifetime of a vehicle would probably save money on an electric vehicle, but misinformation is warping the reality, and it might not even be intentional misinformation. It might just be that most people haven't had time to sit down and think, okay, if I can charge it at home because I have a driveway and I can get on an EV tariff, actually over 10 years, I probably would save money by having an electric vehicle. So I don't know if that's kind of weaponized misinformation rather than just reality not getting out there. But it feels like to me that misinformation is playing a part there in that perception of cost, albeit there are also cost issues with the cost of public charging because of the cost of electricity and other non-quantity costs and upfront costs of new electric vehicles.
Yeah, I'd agree with that to an extent, because we've, the sheer range of vehicles, as in the choice of vehicles, in addition to the kind of huge variability in the prices of used vehicles, given where we are on, supply side of used, plus the real proliferation of different ways of owning or financing or driving an electric vehicle or any vehicle for that matter, means that there is just no validity to a blanket statement like EVs are cheaper or are this or are that. And when you layer on then the variability of the cost of charging depending on your own circumstances, being able to charge at home or, for example, for a lower cost, there is a huge amount of variability that a blanket statement like that, often it not only does it, but it can really serve to of undermine someone's own decision-making process. And that's another reason that why it's not until you kind of get into conversations with people and they start their own research, but then it's really when you kind of open up this realm of potential options to prospective drivers that you can see that there's actually kind of savings and economizations kind of right across the piece. Not to mention sort of things like the ongoing costs around maintenance and so on, which can be really favourable in electric. So I think we're kind of entering a really good sort of there's a huge amount of opportunity when it comes to cost savings and with EVs and charging, but there's just so many variables so as to make it so difficult to be able to say it's going to be cheaper. And then what that might look like in 1 or 2 or 5 years time as well.
Yeah, well, it's frustrating, isn't it? Because we have to be very careful not to make blanket statements, because there are people, organisations who would really love to be able to kind of point out that the fact that maybe weren't entirely the case for every single person, despite the fact that those same people are often making blanket statements to the opposite. And I think sort of James and Vicky, the fact of it in both of your statements that you can argue on LinkedIn all day and that people feel like they're speaking to sort of someone who's never going to listen or change their mind are the same issue, aren't they? Because ideally on LinkedIn you'd tell someone that actually this is not how things are, and they'd go, oh God, you're right, and move on. And I think that something else that is emerging from this, and we've touched on media, which we actually had a question about from Thomas, but you in your question have asked how we counter newspapers and reporters, and I think that highlighting that there is sort of a personal element where it is specific reporters who have the platform to write an opinion piece or present an opinion as a news piece. Likewise, it's people who are in positions of power who, for whatever reason, have their own negative view, and that filters down. In short, how can we deal with those people? Like, how do we counteract those very vocal or very powerful people, if at all?
It might be worth me jumping in at this point. One of the 3 strands of work that EV UK does is engage with the media, and particularly broadsheet print and broadcast, sort of audio, radio, long form, podcasts, and so on. Those are our target media channels to engage with. And what's really interesting about that is that, look, you can't, you're a participant in the media ecosystem, which is, the business model of which requires people to click and look at what you're writing. And so if it's controversial or if it speaks to a particular, opinion base, then it's going to get those clicks, right? And EVs, I hear from radio producers all the time that the EVs get the phone lines ringing, and so that's why they cover them. And it's not because people want to tell everyone how much they love their electric vehicles, right? That's because a lot of people, do not like them, and it's the same for the print media as well. That said, there's got to be a space for kind of a rational response to those opinions, and that's where EV UK comes in. So in the last calendar year, we had within the EV sort of trade, if you like, the EV sector, a 25% increase, and that really goes to underscore how there is a place for rational views and rational evidence and robust kind of content that isn't just dog whistle shouting about how these are terrible and all the which ways that they are. So there is, despite that there are a lot of media business models that thrive off the fact that there's negativity about EVs out there, there is always a place for the alternative view, and that's where EV UK tries to participate.
Definitely. And well, I think it's also relevant sort of circling back to what we were saying right at the beginning, you know, EVA England and Vicky are listening to people who do have valid complaints about their experience. And I think it's about being able to kind of hold space for that and engage with that while also maintaining the kind of drive forward and the need for this technology area. Now, I wonder if it's worth moving slightly onto the questions that have been coming through. There's a lot here that I think we would be running out of time to answer entirely, but to go sort of vaguely in the order that they've come in as. There's a question about how the industry can build an EV ecosystem with the right chargers in terms of speed, I think are in the right place. James, I wonder if that's something, again, that you can speak to with your knowledge of sort of where chargers are at the moment.
Yeah, so I think that comment came in after I did the national numbers of chargers spread across on street, en route and destinations. And actually that person asking the question is absolutely right to ask it. It's not about overall numbers. We all know that, and it's getting right chargers in the right place to get as many people driving EV as possible. So yeah, yeah, it's not about the national number. I can't really say any more than that, other than right chargers in the right places.
I suppose there's a kind of layer beneath that, I think, from the driver's point of view. So I think, you know, if you're building out for residential charging, so I think there's a big difference, as James has kind of indicated, between en route charging. You know, motorway fuel prices are higher than the fuel prices that people pay off the motorway. People perhaps are willing to pay a bit more, and they just need to access a charger when they're on a long journey. They just need it to be there and they need it to work. That's quite a different market to the on-street residential market for the driver, where you need these chargers to be kind to the battery, which means slower speed. You know, you don't want your vehicles plugged into an ultra rapid all the time, because it's not great for many of the batteries, and you need them to be cheaper. And that's where there's almost these two markets for drivers. And I think that market is the destination chargers and the on-street market, and that's about them being in the right place, but also being easy to access and affordable. The government has a public charging review out at the moment. It was actually announced alongside the new pay per mile scheme, but perhaps didn't get as much attention as it should have done at the time. So this is an independent review that is being kind of worked on by government officials at the moment. And as an organisation, we are hugely focused on that review, because we want some clear things out of it. So one, we want clear action to drop prices at the charge point for consumers, so not just for industry to recoup its investment, but for consumers to see a drop in prices. And I noticed there was a question about VAT in the chat above. That is absolutely part of that charging review, but there are other things as well that are actually contribute more to the price of charging, such as wholesale energy costs and land use planning costs. So that all needs tackling by this public charging review, and we really want to see some concrete actions out of that. We also want to use the review to leverage a better experience at charge points. So actually, you know, we do have charge point regulations. They're not brilliantly enforced at the moment. We need to make sure they are. So I think, you know, this review is a real opportunity for drivers to really try to put their views across, and government is definitely willing to listen at this point. It knows that the system is not working as well as it should do. It knows that we're about to hit a difficult point in the market where we need to persuade drivers without driveways to access these vehicles. And so it is a really good moment to bring some of these issues to their attention, and to make sure that driver's voice gets heard as part of that review. So that is a really key piece of work going on at the moment.
Absolutely. And I think, yeah, perhaps as much as we need to be engaging with consumers and the public, there does also need to be that engagement sort of higher up to the people who perhaps have more power to implement these sorts of changes. There's a question here that I think it is asking if any of the panel sort of know figures for how many charging hubs have safety confidence or safety measures installed. I could be wrong, but I don't know if that's super well tracked.
It basically at the moment, with the communications protocol between charge points and people like ZapMap, e-mobility service providers, who then serve that data up to electric vehicle drivers and help them choose which site to go to. The standard that's currently in existence doesn't really allow for that kind of data to be passed through, though a new iteration is being drafted at the moment. So it's called OCPI, and yeah, the newer version of OCPI will allow other things to be included. For instance, there's talk about it including things like PAS, and whether it's PAS compliant or not. So basically, is it suitable for drivers with accessibility issues, and even breakdowns of which accessibility issues I've heard discussed as well. So yeah, definitely room for improvement there.
I think just to jump in on the accessibility point, because we sort of campaigned quite hard to make sure that that PAS standard was enshrined in legislation, not just a voluntary standard last year. So that's now a part of the Automated Electric Vehicles Act. However, this updated standard has still not been rolled out or put forward by government. So I think the PAS standard at the moment is pretty difficult to deliver on by industry. There is an updated standard, but that's been slightly caught up in wider discussions. I think there's a new EU standard emerging. So the whole process has slightly stalled again. So again, it's kind of, we really need to get that standard out there. We really need industry to start being able to deliver against that standard. And then there is legislation now behind the scenes to bring forward regulation if industry don't voluntarily comply. But as James said, the standard itself is restricted to the kind of physical kind of capacity of the charge point. So actually, if you're a user with a wheelchair, can you access that charge point? Is there enough space around it? Are the payment terminal heights at the right point? Exactly, is the cable weight manageable? The wider safety considerations around well-lit sites are outside of that standard. As James said, they need integrating somehow. I think there are companies who do record that and measure it and feed that information into government. I'm sure many on this call have heard of sort of Safe Charge, Charge Safe. So there are people watching that space and definitely campaigning for it. And I think once those core standards are in place and enforced, then I think the whole system will get better for the driver.
Definitely, and I think yes, while it's perhaps not as tracked yet as it should be, I don't think that means that there's no charging sites in existence that already have those things as well. It's slower because ultimately it's more overhead and more development is required, but I think it is something that is getting increasing amounts of focus, and hopefully will continue to do so. I think the next question references there being more focus on women and EVs, especially in recent weeks. I know that there was last week the launch of Women in EV Day, which perhaps is what this person is referencing. But yes, I suppose, so the question is how we approach female drivers and give them the confidence they need. I wonder if secondary to that, there's the question of whether we need to approach female drivers differently or separately as a distinct group from all other drivers. And I suppose if yes, then how? I don't know if anyone wants to weigh in there.
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. You know, one of my first jobs in this sector was working for Nissan, and they sort of, our company has done the same. In fact, they all have, is turning the question of who vehicles are for, and who's ultimately deciding on buying them, and then who's actually transacting. And you know, you can't. I think what we do at EV UK, because we're not marketing and we're not a car company ourselves, is just, I say this a lot, but it's true. We meet people figuratively and literally. So you know, figuratively, you know, whoever you are, whatever street you've just walked off, and you want to look at a particular car, you know, we will talk to you about it. And I think, you know, your gender or your lifestyle or whatever it is that is a consideration in that decision is secondary to, can any of these 10 different used and new EVs that we have on show work for you? That's kind of how I approach it and how we approach it at EV UK. You know, that said, when we talk about the sort of non-spec considerations, so outside of range and speed, charge, and all of that stuff, we do speak about issues tend to be more heavily considered by women and those with caring responsibilities. That is just a fact of life. They do different things with their vehicle other than drive it. They need to carry people and goods and stuff and all of the rest of it. And so those are considerations that I would say women come to us more often with. But I think at the end of the day, it's really, I take people where they are in their journey, wherever, whichever way that they want to enter the conversation, whoever you are, we're going to get into an EV if you're not already in one.
James has taken himself out of this part of the conversation. He's gone dark.
Exactly.
Now we've got a question about how one could work with EV UK and EVA England. I'm going to assume that is from a business perspective as opposed to on the kind of like engaging as a consumer. But what I might say is that if you reach out post webinar, then I'm sure connections can be made and agreements to work together can be formed. We've got another question asking about the government's recent promotional campaign, and then what an effective campaign should include. I think interestingly, or not interestingly, but a sort of marketing webinar would perhaps benefit the industry too. If sort of these are the marketing campaigns that work specifically for EV. But yes, I wonder if any of you would like to weigh in on what you thought of the campaign and what an effective campaign would include.
I might say a bit, but I'll hand over to Tanya on the sort of wider sort of comms marketing side. But I think again, linked to the previous question, I've seen some, I don't know, many of you probably read Tom Riley's Fast Charge newsletter, that the campaign isn't necessarily cutting through to women, which is an interesting finding. And I obviously I haven't read the article properly yet to understand some of the data behind it. I mean, I think the campaign on the face of it looks very good. It looks very nice. I think a lot of us are involved in working with DFT on it to kind of extend its reach. I'd say the one thing that it's very much targeted at the easy wins at the moment. So it's targeted at those people who should really be in electric cars because they can afford them, because they have driveways, because it works for them, which is really important because there's a vast number of drivers who should be in them who aren't, and that's really important. What I think it could do as well is perhaps shine a light on some of the other areas which are working really well. So actually those hard scenarios that we're about to hit in the market where, households without driveways who are really making it work for them, because you need to show that side of the EV story as well. And a DFT funded campaign probably has a bigger reach than those of us who are kind of much smaller and really trying our best to get some of these good stories out, but perhaps don't have the resources that the government have to do that. So I'd like to see it extend a little bit into some of those harder to reach areas. I'd very much like it to do something on cross pavement, because we certainly hear a lot from our drivers that surely a cross pavement solution is better than letting people trail cables across the pavement, sometimes over walls, over trees, over lampposts, just to get a cheaper charge to their car. So actually, again, these are things that, how to get people to take this sector more seriously, how to show them all these fantastic new technologies that are actually working for people. So in time, I'd like it to go away from some of the easy wins and into some of the slightly harder wins, but actually there might be an audience there who are genuinely keen to transition to electric and don't know how, and would love to hear from somebody in their similar circumstance on how to do that. But Tanya may have a view more on the kind of marketing side than me.
Yeah, it's really interesting how the launch of this campaign has kind of created this constituency of armchair advertising executives who all think that they could have done it better than the government. And I think for me, it's, there are the key point, as I said, is that this is a starting upon which not just the government can develop its messaging, but all of us can. It's a jumping off point to start a conversation, and we're noticing that there is an uptick in awareness upon which we can all build as industry professionals. So that's a good thing. And the other thing I think that's important is that, this is a an awareness campaign. You know, it's not, people are sort of beginning to be concerned that it's sort of not delivering some sort of huge uplift in EV sales. I mean, that's not the purpose of it. And, you know, you're not going to see anything that quite that dramatic happen as a result of a campaign. You know, what I will say is, you know, despite the fact that, frankly, the government is not one of the trusted sources of information or well-liked sources of information at this moment in time, you know, fair play to them for doing something in this space. I wish that they hadn't preceded this, you know, this initiative with a policy that in EVED, which is you know, damaging people's kind of perceptions of how ready they are and how expensive it is going to be to drive an electric vehicle. It does seem like a real non sequitur that we could have done without. That said, let's take it for what it is, which is an opportunity for us to enter into a conversation with people that maybe just hadn't thought about EVs before. So yeah, it's good for now, and progress that we can all still make based on the start that has made.
Can I just add as well? I'm just happy that they're doing something, and yeah, like both of you guys have said, is it the end solution? Could more be done? Sure, yeah, absolutely. But there's something out there now. That's a really good thing. I've heard people arguing that it shouldn't be the government's responsibility to tell people that whether electric cars are good or not. And actually, I mean, when I was a kid, there were adverts telling you to wear seatbelts in the back of a car, and all manner of other public health information things. And EVs are a public health issue. They make the air a lot cleaner, and a lot of people die prematurely from air pollution. So absolutely, the government should be saying and doing something. And yeah, I'm glad they are.
Definitely. And I think in closing, it's good to come back to what, Tanya, you said at the beginning, which is that in the 15 years that you've been engaging with this industry and working in the industry, it's only in less than a third of that there's been this kind of shift to real skeptical and anti-EV narrative. And if we think about how quickly things change and develop in this industry, I think that, you know, we're already at a good starting off point, and I think that I've certainly got a lot of faith that as we continue to learn about this, things will improve. And, you know, this time in a year it might be an irrelevant topic to be talking about, is hoping. But yes, thank you to everybody who tuned in. The slides and recording of the webinar will be emailed to you in the next week. And on everyone's behalf, and for myself as well, I'd love to thank Tanya, James and Vicky. Thank you so much for being here and sharing your insights. This has been a really interesting discussion. And yeah, thank you for taking the time.
Thank you for having us.
Brilliant. All right. Okay. Well, thank you, everybody. And yeah. Also, if anyone who sort of has follow up, if you reach out to either me or through the EV Infrastructure News info email, then I will happily direct you to the right person to answer your query. So yes, thanks again, everyone, and enjoy the rest of your days.